There are moments in life when the ordinary world cracks open and something utterly impossible steps through. These are the stories of people who looked into the darkness and saw something looking back. Stories that refuse to fade despite every rational explanation thrown at them. Tonight, we explore 8 encounters with creatures that defy understanding. It was a cool April evening in Dover, Massachusetts, and the kind of night when teenagers drove aimlessly through town looking for something, anything, to break the monotony of suburban life. 17-year-old William Bartlett, known to his friends simply as Bill, was behind the wheel of his father's Volkswagen, cruising down Farm Street with 2 companions, Mike Mazzacco and Andy Brody. It was just past 10:30 in the evening on April 21st, 1977, and the 3 boys were doing what teenagers have done for generations, talking about nothing important, listening to music, letting the hours drift by without purpose or destination. Farm Street was the kind of road that defined rural Massachusetts, narrow and winding, lined with old stone walls that had been there since colonial times. The walls were broken in places, weathered by centuries of New England winters. And as Bill's headlights swept across one of these crumbling barriers, something moved. At first, Bill thought it might be a dog or a cat, some neighborhood pet that had wandered too close to the road. But as the light caught it more fully, he realized with a jolt of pure instinct that this was nothing he had ever seen before. The creature was small, perhaps 4 feet tall at most, and it was perched on top of the stone wall in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if it had been waiting there. Its body was thin, impossibly thin, like something stretched beyond the limits of biology. The skin, what Bill could see of it in the brief moment before his car passed, was tan and rough, the texture of sandpaper left out in the weather. But it was the head that stopped his breath, a massive watermelon-shaped skull that seemed far too large for the spindly body beneath it. And set into that oversized head were 2 eyes that glowed orange in the headlights, not reflecting the light the way an animal's eyes might, but glowing from within, like glass marbles lit by some internal fire. Bill's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The creature's fingers were long and thin, tendril-like appendages that wrapped around the stones of the wall with an almost delicate precision. There was no nose that he could see, no mouth, no ears, just that blank face dominated by those enormous glowing eyes. The whole encounter lasted perhaps 7 or 8 seconds, maybe less, just the time it took for the car to pass from one side of the creature to the other. When Bill turned to look back, it was gone, vanished into the darkness as completely as if it had never been there at all. He didn't say anything at first. How could he? What words could possibly capture what he had just seen? But Andy and Mike had noticed something was wrong. Bill's knuckles were white on the wheel, his face pale in the dashboard light. They asked him what was wrong, and finally, haltingly, he told them. He described the thing on the wall, the huge head, the glowing eyes, the impossible proportions. His friends were skeptical, and who could blame them? It sounded like something from a science fiction movie, not something you'd encounter on a suburban street in Massachusetts. They drove back to Farm Street, slowly this time, searching the walls and the woods beyond, but there was nothing. The creature, whatever it had been, was gone. Bill went home that night and couldn't sleep. The image of those orange eyes kept floating up in his mind, refusing to be dismissed or rationalized away. He had grown up in Dover. He knew what animals lived in these woods, knew the difference between a dog and a cat and a deer. This had been none of those things, this had been something else entirely. Around midnight, unable to shake the image, he sat down and drew what he had seen, working from memory to capture the proportions, the stance, the terrible wrongness of it. On the paper he wrote, carefully and deliberately, "I comma Bill Bartlett, comma swear on a stack of Bibles that I saw this creature." It was a statement that would follow him for the rest of his life. What Bill didn't know was that he wasn't alone. Just 2 hours after his encounter, 15-year-old John Baxter was walking home from his girlfriend's house along Miller Hill Road, a journey he had made countless times before. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over small towns after dark, and John was in no particular hurry. He was thinking about nothing in particular when he noticed something moving ahead of him on the road, a dark shape that seemed at first to be another person, someone else out for an evening walk. But as he got closer, perhaps within 15 feet of the figure, he realized it wasn't a person at all. The proportions were all wrong. The head was too large, the body too thin, the stance too unnatural. John stopped walking. The figure stopped too, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other in the darkness. Then, with a movement that was both fluid and wrong, the creature turned and scrambled down the embankment beside the road, disappearing into the trees near a gully. John followed, drawn by a mixture of fear and fascination, and caught sight of it again standing next to a tree, its large eyes reflecting what little light reached into the shadows. Those eyes, he would later say, seemed to glow with their own light. And the hands, if you could call them that, were long and tendril-like, grasping the tree trunk in a way that seemed almost human, and yet utterly alien. John didn't wait to see more. He turned and ran, his heart pounding, not stopping until he reached the safety of his house. Like Bill, he sat down that night and drew what he had seen. And like Bill, his drawing showed a creature with an oversized head, thin arms and legs, and large glowing eyes. The two boys didn't know each other well, hadn't spoken before that night, had no reason to coordinate their stories. Yet their descriptions and their drawings were remarkably, unsettlingly similar. The next night, April 22nd, the creature appeared again. 15-year-old Abby Brabham was riding with her boyfriend, Will Tainter, along Springdale Avenue when she saw it standing upright beside the road, leaning against a tree in a posture that seemed almost casual. This time, the eyes glowed green rather than orange, but everything else matched the descriptions from the night before. The large head, the thin body, the strange proportions. Abby's description was consistent enough with Bill's and John's that there could be no doubt whatever these three teenagers had seen, it was the same thing, or at least the same kind of thing. When cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman heard about the sightings, he arrived in Dover within days to interview the witnesses. Coleman was a careful researcher, skeptical by nature, but open to the possibility that something genuinely unusual had occurred. He brought in other investigators, people with backgrounds in astronomy and ufology, trained in interviewing witnesses and evaluating evidence. What they found impressed them. The witnesses were credible, their stories consistent, their demeanors sincere. None of them seemed to be lying or seeking attention. Bill Bartlett, in particular, came across as reluctant to discuss his experience, embarrassed by the attention it brought him, wishing in some ways that he could take it back. The investigators couldn't find any physical evidence, no footprints or hair samples, no photographs or video footage. But they also couldn't find any evidence of a hoax. the timeline didn't work for the teenagers to have coordinated their stories. They lived in different parts of town, moved in different social circles, had no obvious motive to fabricate such a bizarre tale. And the sightings themselves, brief and fleeting, lacked the kind of elaboration that typically accompanies made-up stories. There were no dramatic chases, no supernatural abilities, no cosmic messages, just 3 teenagers who had seen something strange and couldn't explain it. Coleman named the creature the Dover Demon, a label that stuck despite its somewhat sensationalistic tone. The name came partially from the town, partially from the creature's otherworldly appearance, and partially from Coleman's own sense that this was something unique in the annals of cryptozoology. The Dover Demon didn't fit the known patterns of ghosts, fairies, or euphonauts. It wasn't Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster or any of the other famous cryptids that populated the margins of belief. It was its own thing, an animate anomaly that had briefly intersected with the lives of 4 credible young people and then vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Skeptics, of course, had their theories. Some suggested the teenagers had seen a baby moose, though baby moose don't stand on 2 legs, don't have oversized heads with glowing eyes, and are in any case extremely rare in eastern Massachusetts. Others proposed a foal, perhaps one that had wandered away from a nearby farm, but the sightings occurred in April, which was not foaling season, and no reports of missing foals emerged from the area. A few suggested great horned owls, large birds native to the region with distinctive ear tufts that could be mistaken for horns and eyes that reflect light in an eerie way. But owls don't walk on 2 legs, don't stand 4 feet tall, and don't match the detailed descriptions provided by multiple independent witnesses. Bill Bartlett remained haunted by his experience for years afterward. In interviews decades later, he expressed a mixture of frustration and resignation about the whole affair. On one hand, he knew what he had seen. The memory was as clear and vivid as any memory he possessed, perhaps more so because of its strangeness. On the other hand, he understood how it sounded to other people, understood the skepticism and the doubt, even understood why some might think he had made it up or been mistaken. In a lot of ways, he said, it's kind of embarrassing to me. I definitely saw something. It was definitely weird. I didn't make it up. Sometimes I wish I had. The Dover Demon was never seen again after those 2 nights in April 1977. There were no follow-up sightings, no copycat reports, no ongoing encounters that might have sustained the story in the public consciousness. Within weeks, the media attention faded, and Dover returned to being just another quiet suburban town outside Boston. But for Bill Bartlett, John Baxter, and Abby Brabham, the memory lingered, a permanent fixture in their personal histories. A reminder that the world contains things that resist explanation, things that appear and disappear without warning or reason, leaving behind only questions and the testimony of those who witnessed them. Today, nearly 50 years later, the Dover Demon remains one of the most intriguing cases in American cryptozoology, not because of what we know about it, but because of what we don't. It appeared for 2 nights, was seen by multiple credible witnesses, and then vanished completely. No bodies were found, no habitats discovered, no evidence emerged to prove or disprove its existence. It simply was, briefly and intensely, and then it wasn't. And perhaps that's what makes the story so compelling. The idea that sometimes, just sometimes, the world reveals something impossible, something that doesn't fit into our carefully ordered categories of known and unknown, and then snatches it away again before we can make sense of it. the small town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, sits at the confluence of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, a place where water and land meet in a landscape of hills and valleys typical of Appalachia. In the autumn of 1966, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where life moved at a predictable pace, and where the most exciting event of any given week might be a high school football game or a church social. But that was about to change in ways that no one could have predicted, ways that would put Point Pleasant on the map for reasons both terrible and strange. The first hint of something unusual came on November 12, 1966, when a group of gravediggers working in a cemetery near the town of Clendenin, about 10 miles from Point Pleasant, reported seeing something massive soar overhead. They described it as a brown, human-like figure with enormous wings, something that moved from tree to tree with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for anything of that size. The gravediggers were scared, which is saying something for men whose profession involves spending their days among the dead. But they reported what they had seen, and the story spread through the local community, creating a ripple of unease that would only grow in the days to come. 3 days later, on November 15th, 4 young people had an encounter that would transform that unease into outright terror. Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Millette were 2 young married couples, friends who often spent time together, and on that particular evening, they decided to go for a drive in Roger's car. They headed north of town toward an area known as the TNT plant, a former World War II munitions factory that had been abandoned after the war and left to decay into a landscape of crumbling concrete igloos and overgrown roads. It was the kind of place teenagers went to be alone, to drink beer away from the watchful eyes of parents and police, to explore the eerie ruins of industrial infrastructure slowly being reclaimed by nature. It was around 11:30 at night when they saw it. At first, Linda thought she was looking at 2 red lights reflecting off something metallic, perhaps a piece of abandoned equipment or a broken-down car. But as they got closer, she realized with a shock of pure animal fear that the lights were eyes, huge glowing red eyes set into the head of something that stood 6 or 7 feet tall near the old power plant. The creature was shaped like a man, she would later tell reporters, but bigger, maybe 6.5 to 7 feet tall. It had large wings folded against its back, wings that seemed impossibly large for any bird, and it was those eyes that got them. Eyes that seemed to bore into their very souls with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. Roger hit the accelerator and the car lurched forward, tires spinning on the loose gravel. The creature spread its wings, massive leathery appendages that stretched perhaps 10 feet from tip to tip, and took flight. And then, impossibly, terrifyingly, it began to chase them. Linda screamed. Steve and Mary, in the back seat, pressed themselves against the windows, trying to see the thing that was pursuing them through the darkness. It flew alongside the car, keeping pace with them even as Roger pushed the speedometer past 80, 90, even 100 miles per hour. It made no sound, or at least no sound they could hear over the roar of the engine and the rush of wind through the open windows, just flew silently beside them like a nightmare given form and substance. They didn't slow down until they reached the city limits of Point Pleasant, and even then Roger kept driving, not stopping until they reached the Mason County Courthouse, where they burst through the doors and poured out their story to the bewildered deputy on night duty. They were visibly shaken, their hands trembling, their voices breaking as they tried to describe what they had seen. The deputy, like most people confronted with such a story, was skeptical at first. But the fear in their eyes was real, and when he saw that fear, he believed them, or at least believed that they believed what they were saying. Over the next few days, more reports came in. A volunteer fireman reported seeing a large bird with red eyes. Local residents claimed to hear strange screeching sounds in the night, sounds unlike anything any local bird or animal would make. Newell Partridge, who lived in Salem about 15 miles away, reported that his dog Bandit had gone missing the night before the Scarberries' encounter, disappearing into the woods after barking frantically at two glowing red circles that Partridge saw through his window. The dog was never found. The sightings continued through late 1966 and into 1967, always following a similar pattern. The creature appeared at night, usually near the TNT plant or along the Ohio River. Witnesses described it as having the body of a large man with wings and glowing red eyes. It seemed capable of flight at incredible speeds, keeping pace with cars traveling at highway speeds. Some witnesses reported that it made no sound when it flew, while others claimed to hear a high-pitched screech or a sound like wings beating against the air. It was seen lurking near homes, perching on roofs, standing in fields watching the roads. Each sighting added to the growing sense of dread that was settling over Point Pleasant, a feeling that something terrible was coming, something that the creature with its red eyes was perhaps warning them about, or perhaps heralding. Local journalist Mary Heyer, who worked for the Athens, Ohio Messenger, found herself covering the story almost daily, interviewing witnesses, documenting sightings, trying to make sense of the phenomenon that was gripping her community. She was joined by John Keel, a writer from New York with an interest in paranormal phenomena, who arrived in Point Pleasant in late 1966 and stayed for months, conducting his own investigation and developing his own theories about what the creature might be. Keel believed the sightings were connected to other strange phenomena in the area, including UFO reports and mysterious lights in the sky. He saw the creature not as a simple flesh and blood animal, but as something more complex, perhaps interdimensional, perhaps supernatural, definitely beyond the normal bounds of zoological classification. The creature acquired many names. Some called it simply the bird, others referred to it as the moth. But the name that stuck, the name that would become synonymous with Point Pleasant itself, was Mothman, coined by a newspaper headline writer who drew inspiration from the Batman television series that was popular at the time. The name was somewhat silly, almost comical, but what people were experiencing was anything but funny. The sightings continued, the fear grew, and the sense that something was building towards some terrible culmination became almost palpable. That culmination came on December 15th, 1967, just after 5 in the evening during rush hour. The Silver Bridge, a suspension bridge that connected Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, was packed with cars, 46 vehicles in all, carrying people home from work or out to do their Christmas shopping. The bridge was 40 years old, designed and built in an era when cars were much lighter and traffic much less intense than it had become by the 1960s. The structure had been showing its age for years, small cracks appearing in the metal, minor structural problems that had been noted but never fully addressed. And then, without warning, the bridge collapsed. One moment it was there, solid and dependable, carrying its load of cars and people across the wide Ohio River. The next moment, it was falling, the roadway tilting and twisting, metal screaming as it tore apart, vehicles sliding and tumbling into the frigid water below. 31 cars plunged into the river, 46 people died, crushed by falling metal, trapped in their vehicles as they sank, or succumbing to the cold as they struggled in the icy current. It was one of the worst bridge disasters in American history, a tragedy that devastated Point Pleasant and reverberated through the nation. In the days and weeks after the collapse, people began to connect it to the Mothman sightings. Some claimed to have seen the creature perched on the bridge in the hours before it fell, its red eyes glowing in the dusk. Others saw it flying over the wreckage in the aftermath, watching as rescue workers pulled bodies from the river. For John Keel, who would write about these events in his book, The Mothman Prophecies, published in 1975, the connection was clear. The creature had been a harbinger, he argued, a dark angel of sorts warning of the disaster to come. Whether it caused the collapse or simply knew about it in advance was unclear, but its presence in the months leading up to the tragedy could not, in Keel's view, be coincidental. Skeptics, then and now, reject this interpretation. The bridge collapse, they point out, was a structural failure that had been waiting to happen for years. The bridge had been poorly maintained, inadequately inspected, and subjected to far more stress than it was designed to handle. The official investigation found that a single eye bar in the suspension chain had developed a small crack, a crack that went unnoticed until it finally gave way under load, causing a catastrophic chain reaction that brought down the entire structure. There was nothing supernatural about it, nothing that required the existence of a winged creature with glowing eyes. As for Mothman itself, skeptics argue that the witnesses most likely saw large birds, probably great horned owls or sandhill cranes, their features distorted by darkness and fear and the power of suggestion. But the people who saw Mothman, who felt the terror of being chased by something that should not exist, who watched it hover silently in the night with those terrible red eyes burning in the darkness, they know what they experienced. They know the difference between an owl and something else, between a crane and a creature that defied all attempts at rational explanation. For them, Mothman was and remains real, a presence that haunted Point Pleasant for 13 months before vanishing in the wake of the bridge disaster, never to be seen there again. Today, Point Pleasant has embraced its strange history, transforming fear into celebration and tragedy into tourism. A 12-foot-tall metallic statue of Mothman stands in the town's main street, its wings spread wide, its eyes painted bright red. An annual Mothman festival draws thousands of visitors each September, filling the town with vendors and speakers and enthusiasts who come to celebrate the legend. A museum dedicated to Mothman displays original newspaper clippings, police reports, and eyewitness testimonies, preserving the story for future generations. The tragedy of the Silver Bridge has not been forgotten. Its victims are remembered and honored. But alongside that remembrance is the strange and unsettling story of the creature that preceded it, the winged figure with red eyes that became, for better or worse, Point Pleasant's most famous resident. The sightings in Point Pleasant stopped after the bridge collapse, but reports of similar creatures have surfaced in other places over the years. Chicago experienced a wave of Mothman sightings in 2017. Other cities have reported their own winged humanoids, creatures that echo the descriptions from Point Pleasant. Whether these are the same entity or different manifestations of something unknown, whether they are real flesh and blood animals or something more ephemeral and strange, remains an open question. What seems clear is that the phenomenon that gripped Point Pleasant in 1966 and 67 touched something deep in the human psyche, a fear of the unknown, a recognition that the world still contains mysteries that refuse to be neatly explained away. The summer of 1955 was hot in western Kentucky, the kind of heat that settled over the countryside like a heavy blanket and made people irritable and restless. In the small farming community of Kelly, about 7 miles north of the larger town of Hopkinsville, life followed the rhythms of agriculture and family, of planting and harvest, of church on Sunday and hard work the rest of the week. It was a simple life, in many ways a good life, and nothing in August of that year suggested that it was about to be interrupted by one of the strangest encounters with the unknown ever recorded in American history. The Sutton family farm sat along a rural road, a simple wood frame house with no running water, no telephone, no television, no radio. This was not unusual for the area at the time. Many rural families lived without such modern conveniences, drawing their water from wells, lighting their homes with kerosene lamps, existing in a kind of isolation that is hard to imagine today. On the evening of August 21st, 1955, the house was more crowded than usual. In addition to the family matriarch, Glennie Langford, there were her children and their spouses, her grandchildren, and several visitors, including Billy Ray Taylor and his wife June, itinerant carnival workers who were passing through the area. Around 7 in the evening, Billy Ray stepped outside to get some water from the well. The sky was still light, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, and Billy Ray was thinking about nothing in particular as he worked the pump handle. Then he saw it. A bright silvery object streaking across the sky, moving in a way that didn't match any aircraft he had ever seen, with an exhaust that seemed to shimmer with all the colors of the rainbow. He watched it pass overhead, watched it slow and descend, watched it disappear behind a line of trees not far from the house. He hurried back inside and told everyone what he had seen, expecting excitement, or at least curiosity. But his announcement was met with skepticism and laughter. "Shooting star," someone said. "Meteor," suggested another. Billy Ray insisted it had been something more, something controlled and deliberate, but no one seemed particularly interested in investigating. They returned to their conversations, their card games, their evening routines, and Billy Ray, feeling foolish, settled in with them. Whatever he had seen, it seemed, would remain a mystery. About an hour later, the dogs outside began barking frantically, a sound of pure animal terror that brought everyone to attention. Lucky Sutton, one of Glennie's sons, grabbed a shotgun and went to the back door to see what was disturbing the animals. Billy Ray followed, and when they looked out into the gathering dusk, they saw it approaching from the direction of the trees, from the same area where Billy Ray's silvery object had come down. It was small, perhaps 3 feet tall, with a large round head that seemed to glow with a silvery light. The body was thin and gray, the arms long and seemingly boneless, ending in clawed hands that reached out toward them. The eyes were enormous and yellow, taking up most of the face, and there seemed to be no nose or mouth, just those huge, unblinking eyes fixed on the house. It moved with a strange gliding motion, as if its feet barely touched the ground, and as it came closer, the 2 men could see that it wore no clothes, that its skin had a metallic sheen in the fading light. Lucky raised the shotgun and fired, the blast enormous in the quiet evening. The creature jerked, staggered, but did not fall. Instead, it turned and scurried away with a speed that seemed impossible for something of its size, disappearing into the darkness beyond the yard. The 2 men stared at each other, their hearts pounding. trying to process what they had just seen. Before they could speak, before they could decide what to do next, another of the creatures appeared at the window, its clawed hand reaching toward the glass, its yellow eyes peering in at them with what might have been curiosity or hunger or something else entirely. Lucky fired again, shattering the window, and the creature vanished. But now they were everywhere, appearing at windows, on the roof, in the yard. The family could hear them moving above them, scratching and scraping, the sound of their passage across the roof like nothing any of them had heard before. Every time someone looked outside, there was another one, standing in the shadows, watching the house with those terrible yellow eyes. Billy Ray and Lucky fired repeatedly, their shots echoing across the farmland, but the creatures seemed unaffected by the bullets. Sometimes they would fall when hit, only to rise again moments later and scurry away. Sometimes they would simply ignore the gunfire entirely, continuing their approach as if the weapons were no threat at all. For nearly 4 hours, this siege continued. The family huddled together in the house, the women and children crying, the men taking turns at the windows and doors, firing at anything that moved. The creatures made no attempt to force their way inside, but neither did they leave. They simply maintained their positions around the house, appearing and disappearing, their presence constant and terrifying. At one point, Billy Ray stepped outside onto the small covered porch and felt something touch his hair from above. He jerked back, and Lucky fired at the roof, sending one of the creatures tumbling to the ground before it righted itself and bounded away into the darkness. Finally, around 11 o'clock at night, during a lull in the activity, the entire group made a desperate run for their cars. They piled in, 11 people crammed into 2 vehicles, and drove at reckless speed toward Hopkinsville, not slowing down until they reached the police station. They burst through the doors of the station, all trying to talk at once, describing creatures with glowing eyes and silver skin, describing hours of terror, describing something that the bewildered officers could barely comprehend. The duty officer, perhaps recognizing the genuine fear in their faces, perhaps simply unsure of what else to do, called the state police, the county sheriff, and even the military police from nearby Fort Campbell Army Base. Within an hour, a convoy of police cars was heading towards the Sutton farm, their lights flashing in the darkness, officers armed and ready for whatever they might find. What they found was nothing. The farm was quiet, the night peaceful. There were shell casings scattered around the house, dozens of them, evidence that the family had indeed been firing their weapons. There were bullet holes in the walls and windows, damage consistent with the story they had told. But there were no creatures, no bodies, no physical evidence of anything unusual beyond the testimony of terrified witnesses and the marks of a firefight. The police searched the area thoroughly, looking for footprints or blood or any sign of what might have caused such panic. But the hard-packed dirt of the farmyard revealed nothing, and the surrounding fields were empty of everything except the usual rural darkness. The police eventually left, and the family, with nowhere else to go and exhausted by their ordeal, returned to the house. But the terror wasn't over. Around 3:30 in the morning, Glennie woke to the sound of scratching at the windows. She woke her son, and together they watched as the creatures returned, moving in the shadows, their eyes reflecting the light from the kerosene lamp. This time, there was no shooting, no attempt to drive them away. They simply watched, paralyzed by fear and exhaustion, until finally the creatures retreated once more, and the night fell silent. By morning, the story had spread throughout the region. Reporters arrived, followed by curiosity seekers and self-proclaimed monster hunters. The family, overwhelmed by the attention and terrified by their experience, packed up and left, abandoning the farm and moving away from Kelly entirely. They were never seen in the area again, and though some of them gave interviews in later years, they remained consistent in their descriptions of what they had experienced that night, insisting that something real and terrifying had laid siege to their home. Investigators over the years have proposed various explanations. Some suggested that the family had seen great horned owls, large aggressive birds that might have been protecting a nest near the house. The owl's large eyes could have been mistaken for the creature's yellow orbs, their talons for the clawed hands, their ability to swoop silently for the creature's strange movements. The fact that gunfire didn't seem to harm them could be explained by the difficulty of hitting a bird in flight in poor lighting conditions. It's not an impossible theory, but it requires believing that a family of rural Kentuckians, people who lived surrounded by wildlife and would have been familiar with owls, could mistake birds for humanoid creatures and maintain that mistake consistently over 4 hours of close observation. Others have proposed that the whole thing was a hoax, that the family made up the story for reasons unknown and stuck to it, even when faced with police investigation and national media attention. But this theory has its own problems. The family seemed to gain nothing from the experience except trauma and disruption. They left their home, faced ridicule and skepticism, and spent the rest of their lives fielding questions about one night they probably would have preferred to forget. If it was a hoax, it was one that cost them dearly and brought them no obvious benefit. The United States Air Force, through Project Blue Book, officially classified the incident as a hoax, but this designation seems to have been more of a bureaucratic necessity than the result of thorough investigation. The Air Force was dealing with numerous UFO reports during this period and needed a way to categorize cases that defied easy explanation. Classifying something as a hoax allowed them to close the file and move on without having to address the deeper questions raised by the testimony of multiple witnesses. What remains is a story that refuses to be neatly explained. A night when 11 people experienced something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality, something that left them changed and frightened and certain that the world contains mysteries far stranger than we like to admit. The Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter, as it came to be known, stands as one of the most well-documented cases of alleged alien contact in American history, notable not only for the number of witnesses and the duration of the encounter, but for the fact that it preceded by decades much of the alien abduction mythology that would become common in later years. The creatures described that night didn't match the gray aliens that would become familiar from science fiction and later UFO reports. They were something else entirely, something unique, something that if it existed at all was following its own inexplicable agenda in the fields of rural Kentucky. Evening was settling over Braxton County, West Virginia on September 12, 1952, when 3 boys noticed something unusual in the sky. Ed and Fred May, along with their friend Tommy Heyer, had been playing on the lawn of Flatwoods Elementary School, enjoying the last warm days of summer before the school year got into full swing. The sky was clear, stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue, and that's when they saw it. A bright light streaking across the heavens, moving in a way that didn't quite match a shooting star or an airplane, pulsing with an eerie red glow. They watched it arc across the sky and disappear beyond a hilltop on nearby Bailey Fisher's farm, close enough that they could see it descend, could see what looked like it landing or crashing among the trees on the hillside. The boys looked at each other, excitement overcoming any sense of caution, and ran toward the May household to tell Ed and Fred's mother what they had seen. Kathleen May was a beautician, a practical woman not given to flights of fancy. But when her sons burst through the door talking breathlessly about something from space that had crashed nearby, she found herself caught up in their enthusiasm. She decided to go with them to investigate and brought along Eugene Lemon, a 17-year-old National Guardsman who happened to be visiting, figuring that having someone with military training along might be prudent. The family dog, Ricky, trotted alongside them as they set out into the gathering darkness. The walk to the Fisher farm took them through familiar territory, but as they climbed the hillside toward where the object had come down, everything began to feel strange. A thick mist hung in the air, unusual for the time of year, and it carried with it a smell that none of them could identify, a metallic acidic odor that burned their noses and throats and made their eyes water. As they got closer to the hilltop, they saw a pulsing red light beyond the trees, rhythmic and hypnotic, casting weird shadows through the fog. Ricky, the dog, suddenly bolted, running back down the hill with his tail between his legs, whimpering in fear. Eugene shone his flashlight ahead of them, sweeping the beam across the misty landscape. And that's when they saw it. Standing near an old oak tree, illuminated by both the flashlight and the pulsing red glow beyond it, was something that defied all rational explanation. Something that sent a bolt of pure terror through every person in that group. It was huge, at least 10 feet tall, towering over them as it seemed to float slightly above the ground. The body, if it could be called that, was dark and metallic, shaped almost like a dress or a pleated skirt hanging from a broad upper torso. But it was the head that froze them in place, a shape like an ace of spades, pointed at the top with a round base, and set into that head were two eyes that glowed with a greenish-orange light, eyes that fixed on the group with what might have been interest, or malice, or something altogether alien. Small arms or appendages protruded from the sides of the body, twisted and claw-like, though whether they were actual limbs or something else was impossible to tell in the strange light. For a moment, nobody moved. The creature and the witnesses simply stared at each other, separated by perhaps 15 feet of misty hillside, locked in a tableau of mutual incomprehension. Then the creature began to glide toward them, not walking but floating, its lower portion never quite touching the ground, and it made a sound, a hissing or shrieking noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound that vibrated in their chests and their skulls and their bones. That broke the spell. Kathleen grabbed her sons and turned to run. Eugene stumbled backward, and the entire group fled down the hillside in blind panic, stumbling over roots and rocks, their lungs burning from the strange mist, their hearts hammering with a fear that felt primal and absolute. They didn't stop running until they reached the May house, where they locked the doors and windows and tried to calm down enough to make sense of what they had just experienced. Someone, probably Kathleen, called the sheriff's office, and soon Robert Carr, the local sheriff, along with his deputy and a reporter from the Braxton Democrat named Lee Stewart, arrived to investigate. By this time, it was fully dark, and when they climbed the hill to the Fisher farm, they found the strange mist still hanging in the air, still carrying that terrible smell that made their eyes water and their stomachs churn. But there was no creature, no spaceship, no physical evidence of anything unusual beyond the lingering odor and the traumatized state of the witnesses. The next morning, Lee Stewart returned to the site in daylight and found what he initially thought were landing marks in the grass, 2 elongated tracks in the mud, and traces of a thick, black, oily substance on the vegetation. He reported these findings, sparking speculation that something had indeed landed there, something heavy enough to leave impressions in the ground. But later investigation revealed that the tracks were most likely made by a pickup truck that had driven up to the site the previous night, and the black substance was never analyzed or preserved for scientific study. That would have been the end of it. A strange story from a rural community, dismissed as mistaken identity or mass hysteria, except that other people began coming forward with their own encounters. Audra Harper, who lived 5 miles north of Flatwoods near the town of Heaters, reported that days before the main incident, she had been walking through the woods and saw a ball of fire on a distant hillside. When she looked back, the fire had vanished, and in its place stood a tall, dark figure silhouetted against the trees, watching her. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, had assumed it was another person out for a walk, but after hearing about the Flatwoods encounter, she began to wonder if she had seen the same entity. Then, on September 13th, the day after the main sighting, George and Edith Snitowski were driving on Route 4, a rural highway between Clay and Braxton counties, when their car suddenly died. George tried to restart it, but nothing worked, and as they sat there in the darkness trying to figure out what to do, a foul, sulfurous smell filled the air, and their baby began to cry. A bright light appeared ahead of them on the road, and in that light they saw a figure, 10 feet tall, with a hood shaped like a spade, hovering above the ground. They sat frozen in their car, too terrified to move, as the figure watched them for what felt like an eternity before finally gliding away into the darkness. As soon as it disappeared, their car started without any problem, and they drove away as fast as the engine would take them. The story quickly went national. Newspapers across the country picked it up, radio stations discussed it, and within days the Flatwoods monster had become a sensation. Some people believed the witnesses had seen an extraterrestrial being, perhaps the pilot or inhabitant of the craft that had crashed on the Fisher farm. Others suggested more mundane explanations. An owl perched in a tree whose eyes reflected light in an unusual way, distorted by the fog and the darkness and the emotional state of the witnesses into something far more frightening than it actually was. The United States Air Force investigated as part of Project Blue Book, their systematic study of UFO reports. They concluded that the witnesses had seen a meteor, which was consistent with multiple reports of a bright object crossing the sky that night over several states, and that the creature was probably a barn owl, whose silhouette in the trees combined with shadows and the pulsing light from nearby aircraft beacons could have created the illusion of a large humanoid figure. The smell and the mist, they suggested, were entirely natural phenomena, perhaps related to local vegetation or geological processes, exaggerated in memory by the fear and excitement of the moment. But the people who were there, who climbed that hill and saw something that drove them back down in terror, they knew what they experienced. Kathleen May spoke about it for years afterward, always consistent in her description, always certain that what they had encountered was not an owl or a shadow or a trick of the light, but something real, an alien, and profoundly disturbing. Eugene Lemon was never quite the same after that night, haunted by the memory of those glowing eyes and that terrible hissing sound. The children, now adults, still remember running down that hillside, still feel the clutch of fear in their chests when they think about what they saw. Today, Flatwoods has embraced its monster, much as Point Pleasant embraced Mothman. The town holds an annual Flatwoods Monster Festival, celebrating the weird event that put them on the map. A museum in nearby Sutton displays artifacts and testimony related to the encounter, preserving the story for visitors who come from around the world to learn about this brief intersection between the mundane world of rural West Virginia and something altogether stranger. Giant chairs painted to look like the monster have been erected around the county, photo opportunities for tourists, symbols of how the terrifying can over time become celebratory. Whether the Flatwoods monster was an alien, an owl, or something else entirely may never be definitively known. What seems certain is that on September 12, 1952, several people in Braxton County experienced something that challenged their understanding of reality, something that left them changed and frightened and certain that they had glimpsed something from beyond the familiar boundaries of the known world. In the south of France, in the region once known as Gévaudan, the landscape in the 18th century was one of dense forests and isolated villages, of steep valleys and mountain passes where wolves still hunted and people still lived close to the rhythms of nature. It was beautiful country, certainly, but also harsh country, where survival often meant constant vigilance, and where the line between civilization and wilderness remained thin and easily crossed. In the summer of 1764, that line was about to be crossed in ways that would terrorize the region and capture the imagination of a nation. The first recorded attack came in June of that year. A young woman, a shepherdess tending her cattle in the Mercoeur forest near the town of Langogne, saw something emerge from the trees. At first glance, it looked like a wolf, and wolves were common enough in Gévaudan, dangerous certainly, but familiar, part of the natural order of things. But as the creature came closer, she realized with a shock of recognition that this was not quite like any wolf she had seen before. It was larger, its movements different, its gaze fixed on her with an intensity that felt almost intelligent, almost deliberate. The bulls in her herd sensed the danger and formed a defensive wall between her and the creature, their massive heads lowered, their horns pointed outward. They charged, and the creature retreated, but it didn't run far. It circled back, attempted another approach, and was driven off again. The young woman survived, shaken but unharmed, and told her story to anyone who would listen. But few paid much attention. A wolf had tried to attack a shepherd. The bulls had protected her. Nothing particularly unusual in that. Life in Gévaudan went on. Then, on June 30th, 1764, 14-year-old Jean Boulet was found dead near the village of Les Ubacs. Her body had been savagely mauled, her throat torn out, her head partially separated from her body. The wounds were terrible, far more extensive than a typical wolf attack, and when she was buried, the priest noted in the record that she was interred without sacraments, having been unable to make her final confession. More significantly, he noted that she had been killed by the ferocious beast, suggesting that even at this early stage, even with this first official victim, there was already a sense that something unusual was happening. Over the following weeks and months, more attacks followed. Women and children were targeted almost exclusively, lone individuals tending sheep or cattle in fields far from help. The pattern was always the same: a sudden assault, wounds focused on the head and throat, death coming quickly and violently. The victims were often found partially eaten, their flesh torn away, their bones exposed. but in many cases, large portions of the bodies were left untouched, as if the killer attacked for reasons beyond simple hunger. By autumn, the death toll was mounting, and terror had gripped the populace. This was not the usual danger of wolves, which generally avoided humans unless rabid or starving. This was something else, something that seemed to actively seek out human prey, something that showed no fear of dogs or weapons or large groups of people. Witnesses who survived encounters described a creature larger than any wolf they had seen, with a broad chest, a long tail ending in a tuft, and a stripe down its back. The head was massive, the jaws powerful enough to crush bone, and the creature moved with a speed and agility that made it nearly impossible to track or corner. By December of 1764, rumors began circulating that there might be two beasts, perhaps a mating pair or a parent and offspring. The attacks were coming too frequently and from too many different locations for a single animal to be responsible. Some witnesses claimed to have seen the beast with another creature, while others reported seeing it with what appeared to be young. The speculation only added to the fear, the sense that this was not just one rogue predator, but something more organized, more intelligent, more dangerous. In response to the growing crisis, local authorities organized hunting parties. Captain Jean-Baptiste Duhamel, a military officer, assembled thousands of volunteers, organizing them into coordinated sweeps through the forests and fields of Gévaudan. They set poisoned bait, laid traps, even had soldiers dress as peasant women in hopes of luring the beast into ambush. A substantial reward was offered, enough money to make a peasant wealthy for life. But despite all these efforts, despite the massive manpower deployed and the resources expended, the beast continued to kill, continued to evade capture, continued to terrorize the region. In February of 1765, two professional hunters from Normandy, Jean-Charles Denneval and his son Jean-François, arrived in Gévaudan with promises to end the threat. The elder Denneval boasted that he had killed over 1,200 wolves in his career, and he brought with him a reputation as one of the finest hunters in France. He employed different tactics than Duhamel had used, favoring stealth and patience over large, organized drives. But like those who had come before him, he found the beast elusive, its territory vast, its habits unpredictable. The killings continued. Not all the encounters ended in tragedy. There were moments of resistance, times when intended victims fought back and survived. And these stories spread through the region, offering hope amid the horror. On January 12, 1765, 10-year-old Jacques Portefeuille and 7 friends, ranging in age from 8 to 12, were attacked while tending cattle. The beast came at them with its usual ferocity. But instead of panicking, the children stayed together, forming a tight group and fighting back with sticks and stones. They managed to drive the creature off, and their bravery earned them recognition from King Louis XV himself, who awarded them money and praise for their courage. Even more celebrated was the story of Marie-Jeanne Vallée, a 19 or 20-year-old woman who was attacked on August 11th, 1765, while crossing the River Dégès with her sister. The beast lunged at them from the bank, but Marie-Jeanne was armed with a bayonet fixed to a pole, a makeshift spear she carried for exactly this purpose. When the creature attacked, she thrust the bayonet into its chest, driving it deep, and the beast recoiled, wounded and bleeding, before fleeing into the forest. Marie-Jeanne became known as the Amazon of Gévaudan, the Maid of Gévaudan, her courage inspiring others and proving that the beast whatever it was, could be heard. Finally, in September of 1765, Royal Gunbearer Francois Antoine, a 71-year-old hunter in the service of the king, managed to shoot and kill a large wolf near the abbey at Chazes. The animal was enormous, over 5 feet long and weighing 130 pounds, significantly larger than the average wolf. Antoine was hailed as a hero, awarded money and titles, and the wolf's body was stuffed and sent to Versailles to be displayed at the royal court. The king and his officials declared the threat ended, the beast of Gévaudan slain at last. For 2 months, there were no more attacks, and it seemed that perhaps the nightmare was truly over. But then, in December, the killings resumed. The pattern was the same: lone victims, focused attacks on the head and throat, the same terrible wounds. This beast, if it was indeed the same one or another of the same kind, seemed less afraid of cattle than its predecessor had been, more bold in its approaches, more efficient in its kills. The people of Gévaudan, who had dared to hope that their ordeal was finished, found themselves plunged back into fear and desperation. This time, though, help would not come from professional hunters or royal appointees. It would come from the region itself. Jean Chastel was a local farmer and hunter who had participated in earlier attempts to find the beast. He had even been briefly imprisoned during those efforts, thrown in jail by Antoine for allegedly leading the hunter's men into a bog. But now, with the killings continuing and outside help seemingly ineffective, local authorities organized a new hunt, and Chastel was invited to join. On June 19th, 1767, Chastel and several other hunters took positions on the slopes of Mount Mouchet, waiting in ambush. Chastel, a religious man, was praying over his rosary when the beast appeared, moving through the undergrowth with its characteristic stealth. He raised his rifle, aimed, and fired. The bullet struck true, and the beast, hit in the chest, staggered and fell. The hunting dogs, which had been held back, were released, and they descended on the creature, tearing at it, ensuring it was truly dead. When they examined the body, they found something remarkable. Inside the beast's stomach were human remains, the partially digested flesh of its most recent victim. The creature itself was difficult to identify with certainty. It had some characteristics of a wolf, a large wolf certainly, but also features that didn't quite match. A massive head, unusual coloring, feet and ears unlike those of the wolves commonly found in the region. Some accounts describe it as having been taxidermied and preserved, though the preservation was apparently poor, and the specimen eventually deteriorated beyond recognition. With Chastel's kill, the attack stopped. No more victims were found in the fields of Gévaudan. No more reports came in of women and children being dragged down and mauled. Whatever the beast had been, it was gone, and the region could finally begin to heal from 3 years of terror. In the centuries since, scholars and researchers have proposed countless theories about what the beast of Gévaudan actually was. The most straightforward explanation is that it was simply a large wolf or a series of wolves, perhaps rabid, perhaps unusually aggressive due to injury or hunger. Wolves were common in 18th century France, and wolf attacks, while not frequent, were not unheard of. But this explanation struggles with certain aspects of the case: the sheer number of attacks, the focus on human prey to the exclusion of livestock, the apparent intelligence and strategy displayed by the creature. Others have suggested a hybrid, perhaps a wolf-dog cross, combining the strength and hunting instincts of a wolf with the lack of fear toward humans sometimes found in domestic dogs. Such hybrids are known to exist and can be formidable predators. Still others have proposed more exotic possibilities: a lion or hyena that had escaped from a private menagerie, animals that were sometimes kept by wealthy collectors in that era and whose descriptions might match some of the witness accounts. A few have even suggested a surviving prehistoric predator, though this seems unlikely in the extreme. What seems most probable is that the beast was a wolf, or wolves, but wolves that had developed a taste for human flesh and had learned to hunt humans with unusual efficiency. Perhaps the first kills were opportunistic, a chance encounter that ended in success, and that success led to more attempts, more killings, until hunting humans became the beast's preferred method of obtaining food. Add to this the superstition and fear of the era, the tendency for stories to grow in the telling, the power of collective panic to distort and amplify, and you have the makings of a legend that would endure for centuries. But for the people who lived through it, for the families who buried daughters and sons and wives, for the communities that lived in fear for 3 years, the beast of Gévaudan was not a legend or a mystery to be debated by later generations. It was a real and present horror, a thing that came out of the forests and killed without mercy or reason, a thing that changed the landscape of their lives and left scars that would never fully heal. The frozen block of ice sat in its refrigerated trailer, condensation forming on the glass viewing window, and inside, perfectly preserved in the crystalline frost, was something that looked disturbingly human, yet couldn't possibly be. Throughout the late 1960s and early 70s, thousands of people paid their 25 cents to file past this oddity at state fairs and shopping malls across America, staring at what the signs proclaimed to be a real frozen prehistoric man, the missing link between modern humans and our ancient ancestors, a scientific marvel encased in ice. The man behind the exhibit was Frank Hansen, an Air Force veteran and showman who toured the country with his frozen attraction, moving from carnival to carnival, fair to fair, always drawing crowds, always generating that mix of fascination and disbelief that made for good business. Hansen had multiple stories about where the creature came from. Sometimes he said it had been found frozen in a block of ice by Russian seal hunters in Siberia. Other times he claimed Japanese whalers had discovered it floating in the ocean. Later, he would tell a more dramatic tale involving a hunting trip in Wisconsin, where he had shot what he thought was a deer, only to find 3 man-ape creatures feeding on the carcass, one of which he killed in self-defense before hiding the body and later preserving it in ice. Whatever the origin story, the thing in the ice was undeniably strange. It appeared to be male, roughly 6 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair about 3 to 4 inches long. The body was muscular, barrel-chested, with large hands and feet that seemed disproportionate to the limbs. The face was broad and flat, with a short upturned nose, prominent brow ridges, and features that seemed to blend human and ape characteristics in unsettling ways. One of the arms appeared to be broken, the forearm bent at an unnatural angle. Most disturbing were the signs of violence. One eye had been knocked from its socket, allegedly by a bullet that had entered the back of the skull, and there were what looked like dried bloodstains visible through the ice. For most people who saw it, the Minnesota Iceman was just another carnival curiosity, something to gawk at for a moment before moving on to the corn dogs and cotton candy. But in December of 1968, 2 men who were very far from casual observers came to examine the specimen, and their conclusions would thrust Hansen's sideshow into the realm of serious scientific controversy. Ivan Sanderson was a well-known zoologist and television personality, a Scottish-American who had made his reputation studying unusual animals and investigating reports of creatures unknown to science. Bernard Heuvelmans was a Belgian-French scientist, one of the founders of cryptozoology, the study of hidden or unknown animals, and he had spent decades documenting cases of mysterious creatures from around the world. When college student Terry Cullen, who had seen the Iceman at a shopping mall exhibit and been intrigued by it, contacted these two men and suggested they investigate, they took him seriously. Sanderson and Heuvelmans spent 3 days in December examining the specimen at Hansen's farm in Minnesota, where it was being stored for the winter. They worked under difficult conditions. The creature was frozen solid in a block of ice several feet thick, visible only through a layer of frost-covered glass that made detailed observation challenging. They couldn't touch it, couldn't take tissue samples, couldn't perform any kind of invasive examination. All they could do was look, take measurements through the glass, make sketches, and take photographs. What they saw convinced them both that the Iceman was genuine, an actual hominid of unknown species, possibly a surviving Neanderthal, or some other extinct human ancestor that had somehow persisted into the modern era. Sanderson was particularly impressed by the hands, which had long tapering thumbs and fingers with flat yellowish nails that looked almost manicured. The feet were large and splayed, the kind of feet that would leave tracks resembling those attributed to Bigfoot or other cryptid apes. The body proportions, while unusual, were anatomically plausible, and the damage, the broken arm, the gunshot wound, all looked authentic rather than fabricated. Heuvelmans went further. He prepared a scientific paper describing the specimen and proposed naming it Homo pongoides, ape-like man, suggesting it represented a new species of the genus Homo. He submitted his findings to the Bulletin of the Royal Institute of Natural Sciences of Belgium, where his article was published in February 1969. Sanderson wrote about the Iceman in Argosy magazine, asking readers if this might be the missing link between humans and apes, declaring that one look was enough to convince them that this was the genuine article. The story exploded into the national media. Sanderson appeared on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show during Christmas week to discuss the discovery. Newspapers around the world picked up the story. Suddenly, Frank Hansen's carnival exhibit had become an international sensation. But not everyone was convinced. The Smithsonian Institution, hearing about the claims, expressed interest in examining the specimen scientifically. They sent John Napier, a primatologist with extensive experience in human evolution and a serious interest in cryptozoology, to investigate. Napier examined the Iceman and came away convinced it was a fake, a latex model probably manufactured in California specifically for Hansen's exhibit. He reported his findings to the Smithsonian, which then contacted the FBI with concerns that Hansen might be transporting a human corpse across state lines, possibly a murder victim being passed off as a sideshow exhibit. The FBI investigated but found no evidence of wrongdoing. They concluded that the Iceman was indeed a model, a fabrication, and that no crime had been committed. Hansen, meanwhile, claimed that he had withdrawn the original genuine specimen from display out of fear of legal consequences, particularly given the bullet holes that suggested the creature had been killed, possibly murdered. He said he had replaced it with a model, and that what Napier and subsequent investigators were seeing was not the same thing that Sanderson and Heuvelmans had examined. This claim created an impossible situation. If there had been two specimens, one real and one fake, then Hansen had effectively made it impossible to prove or disprove the authenticity of the original. Sanderson supported Hansen's story, insisting that the specimen he had examined was clearly different from the model that Napier saw, that details of the face and body had changed in ways that couldn't be explained by viewing angle or lighting. But skeptics pointed out that over time, as the exhibit was defrosted and refrozen for transport and display, a latex model might indeed take on different poses and appearances, explaining the discrepancies without requiring the existence of a genuine creature. Photographs from different periods of the exhibit's tour seem to support both interpretations. In some images, the mouth is closed, in others open, revealing what look like large teeth. The position of the limbs varies, the clarity of details changes. Maybe these differences reflect multiple models of varying quality. Maybe they reflect the effects of repeated freeze-thaw cycles on a single model. Maybe, just maybe, they reflect the replacement of a genuine specimen with a fake, exactly as Hansen claimed. The truth, if there is one, probably died with Frank Hansen. He continued to tour with some version of the Iceman for several more years before retiring the exhibit and disappearing from public view. He died around 2004, taking his secrets with him. The Iceman itself, or a version of it, resurfaced in 2013 when it was offered for sale on eBay, listed explicitly as a hoax, a carnival gaffe, a fabrication created for entertainment purposes. It was purchased by Steve Busty, owner of the Museum of the Weird in Austin, Texas, where it remains on display today, still frozen in its block of ice, still drawing curious visitors who want to see this strange relic from a time when the line between showmanship and science was perhaps more blurred than it is now. Looking back on the Minnesota Iceman case, it's difficult to know what to make of it. On one hand, the idea that a genuine unknown hominid could have been preserved and toured around America as a carnival attraction, examined by scientists and then hidden away, seems almost absurdly implausible. On the other hand, the testimony of Sanderson and Heuvelmans, both experienced researchers who had examined many genuine specimens and many fakes over their careers, carries some weight. They both insisted, until their deaths, that what they had seen in December 1968 was real, not a model, not a fabrication, but an actual biological specimen. Perhaps the most likely explanation is the simplest. Hansen commissioned a realistic model for his exhibit, something good enough to draw crowds and generate income. When two prominent scientists showed interest and began making claims about its authenticity, he saw an opportunity for even greater publicity and allowed their enthusiasm to run its course, neither confirming nor denying their conclusions too explicitly, keeping the ambiguity alive because ambiguity was good for business. The story of replacing the real specimen with a fake gave him an out, a way to maintain the mystery even after skeptics debunked what they examined, because what they examined wasn't, according to Hansen, what Sanderson and Heuvelmans had seen. It was a perfect shell game, and whether it was intentional genius or accidental opportunity, it worked. The Minnesota Iceman remains a part of cryptozoological lore, a case that can be argued from multiple angles depending on which evidence you choose to credit and which you choose to dismiss. It stands as a reminder that in the realm of the unknown, in the space between science and showmanship, truth can become as frozen and inaccessible as a body locked in ice. The small town of Enfield, Illinois, sits in the southeastern corner of the state, a rural community of a few hundred people surrounded by farmland and forest. In the spring of 1973, it was the kind of place where nothing much happened, where everyone knew everyone, where excitement was rare and usually welcomed. But the excitement that came to Enfield in late April of that year was not the kind anyone wanted, and it would leave the town shaken and divided, caught between fear of something unknown and fear of their neighbors with guns. It began on the night of April 25th, 1973, around 9:30 in the evening. 10-year-old Greg Garrett was playing in his backyard, probably catching fireflies or just enjoying the warm spring evening, when something emerged from the shadows near the fence. Greg would later describe it as a gray-colored creature, about 4 or 5 feet tall, with 3 legs, a short body, 2 small arms with claws, and eyes that glowed red in the darkness. According to his account, the creature stepped on his feet with its 3 clawed appendages, tearing his tennis shoes to shreds, before the boy broke free and ran screaming into his house. Greg's parents, watching television inside, heard their son's terrified cries and rushed to help. By the time they got to him, he was hysterical, barely able to speak coherently, pointing toward the backyard and babbling about a monster. They calmed him down as best they could, tried to make sense of his story, and eventually, probably convinced that he had simply had a nightmare or an overactive imagination, managed to get him settled for the night. But whatever Greg had experienced, if he had experienced anything at all, was about to be corroborated in a way that no one expected. About half an hour later, Henry McDaniel arrived home with his family. Henry lived directly behind the Garretts, and as he and his wife and children approached their house, the children told him that something had been scratching at the door, trying to get in. Henry thought perhaps it was a stray dog or cat, some animal looking for shelter or food, and he didn't think much of it until he heard the scratching himself, a strange, deliberate sound that didn't quite match any animal he knew. He opened the door, expecting to shoo away whatever was there, and found himself face to face with something that stopped his heart. Standing on his porch, illuminated by the light from inside the house, was a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. It stood perhaps 4.5 to 5 feet tall, gray in color, with a short body and 2 small arms. But most striking were its 3 legs, the third trailing behind the others, and its eyes, huge pink eyes the size of flashlights that seemed to glow with their own internal light. The thing was trying to get into his house. Henry slammed the door, his mind racing, his instincts screaming danger. He ran to his bedroom, grabbed his .22 pistol and a flashlight, and returned to the front door. He kicked it open and fired 4 shots in rapid succession, aiming at the creature on his porch. Later, he would insist that he hit it, that his first shot struck true, but instead of falling or dying, the thing simply hissed at him, a sound like a wildcat, but deeper and more unsettling, and then bounded away into the darkness, covering 75 feet in just 3 enormous leaps before disappearing into the brush along the railroad embankment near his house. Henry called the police, and Illinois state troopers responded to what must have seemed like a very strange call. What they found at the McDaniel house gave them pause. There were shell casings on the porch, evidence that Henry had indeed fired his weapon. There were scratches on the siding, fresh marks that looked like something with claws had tried to force its way in. And there were tracks, unusual tracks that looked somewhat like a dog's prints, but with 6 toes instead of 4, 2 of the prints measuring 4 inches across, and the third slightly smaller, consistent with the 3-legged description both Greg and Henry had provided. The troopers didn't know what to make of it. They searched the area but found no creature, no blood, no body, just the physical evidence that something had happened, that someone or something had been at the McDaniel house that night, and had prompted a man with no apparent history of delusion or attention seeking to fire multiple shots into the darkness. The story, of course, spread rapidly through the community. By the next morning, everyone in Enfield knew about the monster, and reactions were mixed between fear and skepticism. Between those who believed something strange was happening and those who thought Henry McDaniel was either lying or mistaken. Then, 2 weeks later, on May 6th, Henry had another encounter. Around 3 in the morning, he was awakened by the sound of neighborhood dogs barking frantically. He looked out his window and saw the creature again, this time walking along the railroad tracks behind his house, moving with what he described as a casual, unhurried gait, as if it had every right to be there and feared nothing. This time, Henry didn't shoot. He simply watched until it disappeared into the distance. Then he called WWKI radio station to report the sighting. The story by this point had grown beyond Enfield. News media from around the region descended on the small town. Reporters looking for witnesses and stories, photographers hoping to capture images of the creature. And with the media came the monster hunters, amateur enthusiasts armed with guns and cameras who prowled the woods and fields around Henry's house, looking for the beast. This created a problem that quickly overshadowed the original mystery. Armed people, many of them drinking, were wandering through the area shooting at anything that moved, anything that rustled in the undergrowth, or made a noise in the darkness. White County Sheriff Roy Poshard Jr. was not amused. He arrested 5 young men who had come from out of town, heavily armed and claiming to have seen the creature, though his investigation suggested they were mostly just out drinking and raising hell. He made threats against Henry McDaniel, warning him to stop talking about the monster or face charges for inciting panic. He told reporters that people were afraid to let their kids out at night, not because of any monster, but because they were afraid the kids would get shot by one of the drunk idiots wandering around with firearms. "There isn't any monster," he declared flatly, and he enforced that declaration by arresting anyone who caused trouble while looking for one. Despite the sheriff's dismissals, a few more people reported seeing the creature, or something like it. Rick Rainbow, a news director for radio station WWKI in Kokomo, Indiana, claimed to have seen a gray, stooped-over figure near an abandoned house not far from the McDaniel property, moving faster than any human could run and letting out a blood-curdling screech that Rainbow managed to record on tape. 2 hunters, Mike Mogul and Roger Tappy, reported seeing a gray monkey moving through the underbrush, but were unable to get a clear shot at it before it disappeared. Cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman, who had investigated the Dover Demon and many other cryptid cases, traveled to Enfield to interview witnesses and examine the locations of the sightings. He looked at the damaged siding on Henry's house, walked the railroad embankment where the creature had been seen, and heard strange screeching sounds that he couldn't identify. He came away bewildered, uncertain what to make of the case. Years later, he would write that the Enfield horror, as it came to be known, was different from most cryptid cases, more like a combination of phantom kangaroo, devil monkey, and swamp ape reports, something that didn't fit neatly into any existing category. As quickly as the sightings had begun, they stopped. After that final encounter in early May, the creature was never seen again in Enfield. No body was found, no conclusive evidence emerged, no explanation was offered that satisfied everyone involved. In 1978, sociologists from Western Illinois University studied the case as an example of social contagion, the way fear and rumor can spread through a community and create a kind of mass hysteria. They concluded that there had been no more than 3 first-hand witnesses, that the stories had been exaggerated and amplified by media coverage and local gossip, and that the whole episode could be explained as a combination of misidentification and collective panic. But that explanation requires dismissing the physical evidence, the tracks and scratches, the multiple independent witnesses, the consistency of the descriptions. It requires believing that Greg Garrett, a 10-year-old boy, made up or misidentified something in his backyard, and that half an hour later, before his story could have spread through the neighborhood, Henry McDaniel independently saw the same thing in almost the exact same way. It requires believing that tracks with 6 toes were either fabricated or misidentified, that grown men fired weapons into the darkness at nothing, that experienced investigators were all fooled by a combination of suggestion and fear. Maybe that's what happened. Or maybe, for a brief period in April and May of 1973, something strange visited Enfield, Illinois. Something that didn't belong in the familiar categories of known animals. Something that appeared and disappeared according to its own inscrutable logic, leaving behind only questions and the memory of those who saw it. Henry McDaniel, interviewed years later, remained adamant about his experience. He knew what he had seen, knew the difference between a dog and a cat and an owl and something else entirely. He had never sought the attention that came with his story, had in fact been threatened with arrest for talking about it, but he couldn't deny what had happened on his porch that April night, couldn't unsee those huge pink eyes staring at him from a creature that had no right to exist. Lake Okanagan stretches through the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, Canada, a pristine body of water over 80 miles long and more than 700 feet deep in places. It was formed thousands of years ago when melting glaciers flooded a valley, creating a series of interconnected lakes that today support thriving communities along their shores. The native Syilx Okanagan people have lived in this valley since time immemorial, and their traditions speak of a powerful spirit dwelling in the deepest parts of the lake, an entity they called Nha-Itk, something to be respected and feared, something that demanded offerings from those who traveled across the water. When European settlers arrived in the 19th century, they heard these stories and interpreted them through their own cultural lens, transforming the indigenous water spirit into a monster, a creature, something physical and flesh, rather than spiritual and symbolic. The first recorded sighting by a settler came in 1855, when a man named John McDougall attempted to cross the lake with a string of horses swimming behind his boat. According to his account, something seized one of the horses and pulled it under the water. Then the others were dragged down one by one until McDougall had to cut the rope connecting them to his boat to avoid being pulled under himself. He called it the Demon of the Lake, and his story became part of the growing mythology surrounding the waters. In 1872, Susan Allison, a Canadian author and pioneer, reported seeing what she described as a dinosaur swimming in Okanagan Lake near her home at Sunnyside Ranch. Her description was specific enough to be taken seriously: a long, sinuous body, a head resembling a horse or goat, movements that suggested something large and powerful beneath the surface. Other sightings followed over the decades, and by the early 20th century, the creature had acquired a name that stuck, though it bore little resemblance to the original indigenous terminology. The name Ogopogo came from a popular British music hall song called the Ogo Pogo, which included lyrics about a funny little creature whose mother was a Polly and father was a whale. A Vancouver newspaper reporter named Ronald Kenvin wrote a parody of the song specifically about the Okanagan Lake creature, and the name caught on, replacing the more serious and spiritual Nha-Itk with something that sounded almost whimsical, almost friendly, better suited for tourism than terror. and tourism was exactly what Ogopogo brought to the region. By the 1920s, the creature had become a local attraction, its image appearing on postcards and souvenirs, its story told to visitors who came to the Okanagan for the scenery and climate and stayed for the mystery. Sightings continued to be reported regularly. In 1926, occupants of about 30 cars along an Okanagan Mission beach all reported seeing something large in the water at the same time. In 1947, a number of boaters witnessed the creature together, and one of them, a Mr. Cray, provided a detailed description. A long, sinuous body, about 30 feet in length, consisting of about 5 undulations, apparently separated from each other by about a 2-foot space, where that part would have been underwater, with what appeared to be a forked tail, of which only one half came above the water. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across decades and across multiple independent witnesses. Ogopogo was typically described as serpentine, anywhere from 20 to 60 feet long, dark in color, though sometimes with lighter patches on the underside, moving through the water with an undulating motion that created a series of humps breaking the surface. The head was often compared to a horse or a goat, and some witnesses reported seeing what looked like ears or horns. It was said to be shy, avoiding boats and people whenever possible, surfacing mainly when the water was calm and sinking quickly when disturbed. In 1978, Bill Stesiuk, a Kelowna resident, had his first sighting while crossing the bridge over Okanagan Lake. He and about 20 other people stopped their cars to watch something in the water, a large form moving just beneath the surface, showing what appeared to be a head with 3 humps following behind it. The experience made such an impression on Stesiuk that he dedicated much of the rest of his life to documenting and investigating Ogopogo sightings, eventually establishing a website where people could report their own encounters. Over the next 4 decades, hundreds of reports would come in, some accompanied by photographs or video footage, others simply detailed accounts of what people had seen. The photographs and videos, when they existed, were almost always ambiguous. Something dark in the water, something that might be a creature, or might be a log, or a wake from a boat, or an optical effect created by currents and geology. Skeptics pointed out that Okanagan Lake had tens of thousands of logs floating just beneath its surface, remnants of the timber industry that had operated in the region for over a century. These logs, when they surfaced or moved with the current, could easily be mistaken for something alive, especially at a distance or in poor lighting. Other explanations included sturgeon, though the presence of these large fish in Okanagan Lake has never been definitively confirmed, or otters swimming in a line, their humps and movements creating the illusion of a single, large, serpentine body. Environmental scientist Robert Young from the University of British Columbia's Okanagan campus offered another explanation, suggesting that some sightings might be caused by a geological phenomenon called overturn, where layers of water at different temperatures pass each other, creating waves and disturbances on the surface that can look like something moving beneath. This would explain sightings that occurred when the water was otherwise calm, and might account for the consistent reports of undulating motion and multiple humps. But these explanations, reasonable as they might be, struggled to account for all aspects of the sightings, particularly those where witnesses claimed to see a head or eyes or other anatomical details that couldn't easily be attributed to logs or otters or water currents. They also struggled to explain the consistency of reports across more than a century, the way descriptions from 1870s matched descriptions from the 1970s and beyond, suggesting that whatever people were seeing, they were seeing something similar enough to generate remarkably consistent accounts. In 1989, perhaps recognizing the cultural and economic importance of Ogopogo to the region, the creature was given official protection under the British Columbia Wildlife Act. This meant that even if Ogopogo existed and could be found, it would be illegal to capture, harm, or kill it. Photography was permitted, encouraged even, but direct interaction with the creature was prohibited. It was a fascinating bit of bureaucratic logic, granting legal protection to something whose existence had never been proven, treating a legendary creature as if it were an endangered species deserving of conservation. The protection was more than symbolic. Ogopogo had become central to the identity and economy of the Okanagan region. The tourist dollars it brought in were substantial. Kelowna and other lakeside communities embraced the creature, using its image in municipal symbols and promotional materials. A museum in Kelowna collected Ogopogo-related artifacts and testimony. Festivals and events celebrated the legend. The creature that had once been a fearsome water spirit and later a mysterious lake monster had become a beloved mascot, something that brought people together rather than driving them apart in fear. In recent years, sightings have become less frequent, though they haven't stopped entirely. In 2018, 3 separate sightings were reported in September, one describing a giant snake approximately 15 meters long. In 2024, someone reported seeing what looked like a long snake in the water. Each new report generates excitement and discussion, draws attention back to the lake and the legend, reminds people that mysteries still exist in a world that often feels thoroughly explored and explained. Scientists have proposed various candidates for what Ogopogo might be if it exists at all. Some have suggested it could be a primitive whale, specifically a Basilosaurus cetoides, an extinct species that matches many of the descriptions provided by witnesses. Others have proposed surviving prehistoric aquatic reptiles, though this seems unlikely given the lack of physical evidence and the improbability of a breeding population of large animals surviving undetected in a well-traveled lake. Still others maintain that Ogopogo is simply a cultural phenomenon, a legend that persists because people want to believe in mysteries, want to think that the world still contains unknowns waiting to be discovered. What seems certain is that something has been seen in Okanagan Lake by hundreds of people over more than a century. Whether that something is a biological creature, a geological phenomenon, a collection of misidentifications, or some combination of all three remains an open question. For those who have seen it, for those who have watched something large and strange move through the water in ways that defied easy explanation, Ogopogo is real. For skeptics examining the evidence from a distance, it remains unproven, a legend without foundation in verifiable fact. Perhaps what matters most is not whether Ogopogo is real in a strictly biological sense, but that it represents something important about our relationship with the natural world, our desire to believe that wildness still exists, that not everything has been cataloged and explained, that beneath the surfaces of our familiar landscapes, there might still be mysteries waiting to be encountered. These stories, spread across decades and continents, share a common thread. Ordinary people in ordinary circumstances encountered something that challenged their understanding of what was possible, something that couldn't be easily explained or dismissed. Whether these creatures were real in a biological sense or manifestations of something stranger, whether they were flesh and blood animals or something else entirely, they left their mark on those who witnessed them, transforming moments of everyday life into encounters with the unknown. And perhaps that's the real story here, not what these creatures were or weren't, but what they reveal about the limits of our knowledge and the persistence of mystery in a world we like to think we've fully mapped and understood. The unknown still lurks at the edges, waiting for the next person to stumble across it in the darkness. If these stories have intrigued you, if they've made you wonder what else might be out there in the shadows and the deep places, consider subscribing to this channel. Hit that like button if you enjoyed tonight's exploration of the strange and unexplained. There are more mysteries waiting to be told, more encounters to be examined, more questions to be asked. Thanks for listening, and remember, the world is stranger than we know.